And welcome to the free state of Texas. I'm from the People's Republic of New York City, so I'm just happy to be here today. This, I think, is such an important day because Myth Informed has been working tirelessly for years, and we are here to stand up for one thing today. Conversation, not cancellation. Myth Informed has been working for years to bring people together of different types of people, different backgrounds, opposite political sides, to fight polarization, find common ground. Because we live in such a time right now where everything is polarized, everything in our lives is political. There's just no escaping it. Where you go to the bathroom is political, how you breathe is political. You can't get away from it. So their main goal is to bring people together and to normalize friendship between left, right, center, all different types of people. What a beautiful goal, right? So when I was asked to host today, I sat down, I was thinking about their goal, you know, a right-leaning person like myself trying to come together with leftists. And I had a hard time writing that. So then I realized why that is. I fucking hate these people. But that's not a good thing. That's a really bad thing. So I'm gonna ask you guys, be honest with me, raise your hands. If you are a right-leaning person, raise your hand if you kinda can't stand leftists sometimes. Be honest, don't get self-righteous on me. All right, keep your hands up. Now, if you're a left-leaning person, raise your hand if you kinda can't stand conservatives pretty often. Look around you. That's just all of us, right? And that is why a day like today is so important. Because if we all feel that way, maybe we're all wrong. Maybe we all have something to learn and we can all benefit from listening to each other a little bit more. That's not something I really like doing. I'm kind of a narcissist. I prefer talking. I hate listening. I literally would rather do anything else. I'd rather watch the Jack Murphy tapes. I would rather have to sit through binging the Rubin Report. There are a lot of things that I would rather be doing than that. But we are all here to listen today because there are people sometimes who don't want to show up and don't want to defend their beliefs. And I think if you aren't willing to have your beliefs challenged, those are beliefs that are not worth having. So we've got some good shit for you guys today. We've got epic panels, iconic speakers. Myth Informed is very dedicated to civil dialogue and high-minded ideas. I'm a bitch on wheels, however, though, so I want to see some drama. I want to see these chairs being thrown. I want people to fight, so you guys got to bring it in the Q&A. All right, I'm going to be here all day running my mouth. Anyone want to place bets on who's going to be the first person to Will Smith me? That friggin' Carrie Smith. So, are you guys ready to get into the first panel? Panel number one is, can you be born in the wrong body? I would say yes, because I feel like I should have been born in Zac Efron's body. I got stuck in the body of an emaciated gay vampire, so can't always get what you want. All right, let's introduce our people. As our moderator on our very first panel, somebody very near and dear to my heart. She is a self-described former SJW who spent years working in the woke comedy industry. She now seeks to deprogram others from the woke ideology. She's the founder of Civility Dinners. You have seen her on Tim Pool, Trigonometry, Friday Night Tights. She is also a hat fashion icon and one of my favorite humans. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Carrie Smith. This next guy is the host of Disaffected, where he shows us how to tell the difference between our Betty Davises and our Joan Crawfords. He is the queen bee helping us spot all the cluster bees. Put your wire hangers together for Josh Slocum. He is an evolutionary biologist fighting reality's last stand against gender ideology. You've seen him on Joe Rogan, PragerU, The Blaze. He's not an alphabet person, but like, he knows a lot about the alphabet people. I would say that he's a beautiful man, but I'm not a biologist. Ladies and gentlemen, Colin Wright. This next guy, he is a self-described SJW. He's kind of my favorite one. Okay, let's be honest. He's kind of like the only one that I like. He is the only person on this panel to have made Milo Yiannopoulos cry. You guys, I'm giving you a homework assignment. When you go home, go on YouTube and type in Milo versus Jangles debate. You're going to need some popcorn. That's all I'm saying. It was like a snuff film. He can be found on his YouTube channel, Jangles Science Lad, where he debates all the bros. Welcome to the stage, Justin Jangles Gibson. What can I possibly say about this chick? If you were to look up the word iconic in the dictionary, you would see her picture. And she'd be wearing like a little outfit. She is the host of her iconic YouTube channel where she has reached over 165 million people. She has inspired an entire movement of trans people pushing back on the woke gender ideology. She is the queen of controversy. It's a moment for her. You don't need me to tell you who she is. You already know. Get your ass on stage, Blaire White.
So we decided to start today with the least controversial topic, which is, can you be born in the wrong body? A 2019 survey by the Trevor Project found that 1.8% of youth identify as transgender. That was in 2019. And that was double the percentage of youth who identified as trans just 2 years prior. Also, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, young people referred for gender treatment increased from 97 people in 2009, this was in the UK, to 2,510 people in 2017. So that was an over 4,000% increase in 10 years. Given the recent explosion of children and adults who are identifying as transgender, I want to start off with the question that brought us on the stage today. The most basic question is, do you believe people can be born in the wrong body? And if so, or if not, what does that mean to you? What do you think that means to you when people say they're born in the wrong body? Do you want to start, Justin?
So I would say it's a simplistic platitude to describe a pretty complex phenomenon. A good analogy would be like the Born This Way movement for gay liberation, right? Advocating for gay people, advocating for gay marriages. You know, I was born this way, and that's not quite true, but it's like kind of the simplistic platitude that we had to like adopt to like sell it to the general public. I think the better question would be like, what would make this person the happiest? I don't believe in like a soul or anything like that. So when someone says, you know, I feel like I'm in the wrong body, I feel like the best way to approach that would be like the scientific approach is, what are the things that we can do to make you happier? And it seems like the evidence points to any sort of like gender affirmative care from kids to adults seems to, at least for some people, the number is definitely not zero, and I would say it's probably the most effective treatment going forward, that it is good to affirm people's gender, makes them feel like who they are, and it's where we should be looking for as a society that values freedom, democracy, and personal liberty.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I would agree. When I heard the question, I thought of a soul, and I think it's kind of a very subjective platitude, like you said. It's definitely something that was kind of spoken of in the older generations. It was kind of how they explained sometimes even cross-dressers and things, and I've never really related to the born in the wrong body narrative, because the word wrong, what does wrong really mean? It's so subjective. So I think, again, I actually agree that the correct question is like, what do we do with people who have gender dysphoria? What is the correct road for them, the roadmap, medical care, etc. And yeah, I don't think I was born in the wrong body. I think I was like meant to be who I am, and that just happens to be a trans person.
Josh?
Yeah. the question, I see this on a philosophical level. I realize that probably most of us here on the stage and most of the people in the audience don't actually believe that someone can be born in the wrong body in that simplistic way. But there are a great number of people out there in this conversation who do in fact believe that and do describe it this way. And I would say that it's a question that doesn't make philosophical sense, because how are you born? You are your body, right? You can feel discomfort in your body. You can feel, I think there's a common experience between, a lot of young gay men. I remember this when I was a boy. I thought I was born in the wrong body. And a lot of what people are called gender dysphoria today, I think, has a close relationship to those kinds of feelings in homosexual people when they're young. And I think it's a matter of rubbing up against stereotyped expectations. But I don't think the idea that, you were supposed to be a man, but you were born in this body makes any sense. Because if we're going to credit that, then we have to get into ideas of essences and souls that, and I'm not trying to drag it into the religious sphere, but, I don't think you can, because I don't think it's a thing that can happen.
Yeah. So I would say the way that it's framed is sort of off, because, this idea that we're born into a body, well, as a biologist, I would say that, we're not actually born into bodies. We're born, we have a body, our bodies and our minds, these things are things that develop in concert together that create a whole human. We don't have this full mind-body distinction that's going on. And to talk about something being wrong, we kind of leave the realm of science at this point. We sort of enter in the realm of metaphysics when we talk about, whether a body can be wrong. We can talk about, a brain that might be atypical in its sort of connectivity or something. But to actually go further and say that, if your brain is so sex atypical or something, therefore it's wrong, that's just not something that science could really say. This is putting what's called teleology into science. This is like a goal-orientedness in nature. Goals are something that we have within society, within cultures, within families. They're things that humans can create. But if we're talking about whether or not, you can be born in the wrong body from the point of view of nature itself, that's just not a claim that really science can validate. It's a unfalsifiable, metaphysical, sort of woo-woo type of thing. So that's where I stand.
So no one likes the question, basically.
Yeah, basically. I think we're in agreement on that one. So what do you guys think is behind the recent explosion in numbers of people who are identifying as transgender, whether that's children or adults?
I think a lot of this can be described by, I think, a changing definition of what it means to actually be trans. So I don't deny that there could be some sort of greater societal acceptance that's involved, make people feel more comfortable to come forward. That's probably explains some of it. But I don't think we would see such a dramatic spike unless there was some aspect of perhaps social contagion that's taking place. And there's an organization, it's called eGale, it's in Canada, and they're responsible for a lot of the LGBT curriculum in schools. And when they describe on a video on their website it's called Trans 101, The Basics, the way that they describe what being trans is, and I think I'm quoting them verbatim, they say, if you don't behave the way society expects you to act based on what's between your legs, so based on your genitalia, that means you're transgender. And then they also go on to say you don't even need dysphoria to be considered transgender. And so a lot of kids, I think, are hearing this, and in a very literal sense, this means that simple gender nonconformity can be sort of put into this umbrella of being transgender. So I think a lot of kids have seen this sort of new redefinition. And under this new definition, a lot of people are trans. I'm non-binary by these definitions because I'm not, a complete stereotype of masculinity. So
how much do you think trans identities are based in gender stereotypes?
I think a lot of the older ones aren't, but a lot of the kids that are coming out are based on those. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you'd be hard pressed to find like a trans advocate, or especially someone who's like a trans specialist working in a clinic, who would say that simple gender nonconformity means that you're the opposite gender. It's going to be a lot more complex than that. Gender identity clinics don't just treat kids who are definitely transgender, but they're also treating kids who aren't behaving in a way that is stereotypical, and that's causing them distress. Like they come to the, hey, I'm not doing the things all the other boys are doing. All the boys are making fun of me. I like girls. I like playing with girls' toys, and so they go to the clinic not necessarily to be diagnosed as trans, but also to like talk through these feelings and why it's okay to be gender nonconforming, why it's okay to not adhere to societal stereotypes. So in the modern conversation around trans issues, yeah, they're not based in stereotypes. It's way more complex than that. It's not just what your behaviors are. It's like who you are. Like where is this coming from? So I think there's enough of historical precedent to say pretty sure that this is not a new thing, that gender identity is not a new phenomenon, that it is rooted in biology, because if it's not rooted in biology, if gender identity isn't rooted in biology, what is it? Is it supernatural? Cybernetic? What else would it be?
Can I say, I think it might be helpful for us to do a little bit of a definition check. What exactly do we mean when we say trans or transgender? And what exactly do we mean specifically when we say gender identity? I'm going to make a guess here. I may get it wrong. If I'm hearing you correctly, I believe that I disagree. I don't believe in gender identity, meaning I don't believe that there is an essence inside people that tells them internally and is part of nature and part of the history of the universe that you are essentially a man or essentially a woman. I know that many people do believe that. I prefer to think of it as personality, inclinations, possibly sex role stereotypes, but I don't accept the construct gender identity. And I don't accept the idea that there have always been people that have a particular gender identity that is at odds with their sex. I think throughout history, there have been people who have felt various levels of discomfort in the sex role stereotype and want to take on traits of the opposite or somewhere in the middle. But gender identity, what exactly do you mean by gender identity?
Gender identity is just your gender that you feel deep within your heart. Now, here's how I can think.
No, wait a minute, though. That's circular.
I know, I'm about to help you explain it. So we're two gay men on stage. So our sexuality is rooted in biology, and it's probably rooted in this notion of sexual drive for the purposes of reproduction, right? So at some points in our development, probably prenatal, probably while we were in the womb, something got crossed, and we are not attracted to the opposite sex for the purposes of procreation. Contained within that is a recognition of your own sex for that same purpose of procreation, right? All right, I need to know that I'm a man in order to find a woman and then procreate with her. So the same thing for sexuality, where wires can get crossed in a certain way with gender identity. That sense of who you are does have kind of a biological basis. It does have a biological use, and human beings are complex, and I think it's good to celebrate that complexity rather than just denying the experiences of a apparently growing number of kids and adults.
And I would just say really quickly, I don't accept the biology-only explanation for homosexuality either, so we may disagree on that as well.
So gender identity is very much real. It's something that's been studied for decades and decades. That's why we have gender identity disorder, which is now called gender dysphoria, and they keep changing the ballgame. This is clearly associated with some sort of mental condition that does cause you distress with your biological sex. So I think people definitely do identify with gender in a way that isn't simply based on stereotypes. I think that you guys are kind of talking past each other in the sense of, I think traditionally transgender people have been understood as something more biological, and it's rooted in gender dysphoria, biology. I think that, as Colin stated, the definition gets so stretched that now there are a lot of people that do relate it to stereotypes. You see documentaries of parents who are allowing 4- and 5-year-olds to take on the identity of a girl if they're biologically a boy. And the reasoning they typically have is that they like the color pink, that they like Barbies, etc. That is definitely watering down the definition of what trans is and historically has been. There are studies showing that, trans women's brain anatomy is sometimes similar to that of biological women. A lot of those studies are squandered by people who say they're controversial. So who knows if we'll get more of those, but there's definitely something biological. There was no reason for me to feel trans at 4 years old, but I did. Obviously, it took me many years to figure that out and identify what the correct path for me was, but it's definitely rooted in biology. I think just throwing out that there's no such thing as gender identity, I mean, you don't have to accept it, but I think that there's enough studies to show that it is real.
So I can take sort of a middle ground, possibly. Like, I do think that some people have what they might experience as a very deeply seated internal sense of being a man or a woman. I don't think everyone has one of those things. I think that's some things that some people feel very deeply and some people don't. But I think that there is differences in definition that we have. So I think that can be a real thing that people can experience. But then, as I mentioned, like these organizations like eGale that are literally defining gender identity being trans based on if you're not acting the way society is expecting you to act based on what's between your legs, then you're trans. Now that's really just rooted in stereotypes. And I know maybe that's not a definition you're using, and that's fine. But to me, it's just like, well, we need to like take the people, the organizations that are making these claims. If I disagree with those, and if you disagree with those, we need to make sure that they hear that we disagree with those definitions, because a lot of kids are hearing that, and in their brains is reinterpreting these as strict gender stereotypes. So I'm just the messenger. I'm just saying what they're saying. Like this isn't necessarily my position on what it is. I just feel that this is probably a big reason why we have a lot of kids that are claiming to be trans. And then unfortunately we have a sort of a medical establishment that I don't think has really caught up to this definitional change. And so we're sort of beginning to medicalize, or at least beginning to push people down that process of medicalization who are simply just gender nonconforming.
In the definition of what trans is, there's also like a cultural meaning too. The way people have viewed transgender people has changed every decade. Actually, every few years now at this point. It's rapidly changing because the conversation's exploded. So initially, people saw it as sort of cross-dressers, and then there was more medical science available. So then it's, biological men who become, trans women, et cetera, vice versa. And then it became any gender identity that isn't your own, so then it's suddenly not just one or two, suddenly it's many. So I think when you expand the definition, it's only natural more people will fit under. Like you said, you technically probably fit under it as well. And then there's also the push to rid gender dysphoria and actual diagnosis from the equation. A lot of activists push for that you don't have to have dysphoria to be trans. So then all that's really left from that is stereotypes. So the people I think that believe dysphoria isn't a factor, if someone could tell me what else the factor would be, other than just a choice for whatever reasons, but I think all that's really left is stereotypes.
I think for people who, so you, Justin, you believe in gender identity, that this is a thing.
Of course.
And I think some people wonder if you can choose, if gender identity, your identity is something you feel in your heart. If you can choose that when it comes to your gender, why can't you choose that when it comes to your race? And I know sometimes people laugh at this question like it's silly, but Rachel Dolezal, there have been several Rachel Dolezals since she hit the news. And so what makes race and the way if a person is raised in a different race and they feel like they're part of that culture, what makes that different than gender?
Because we can have that biological basis for gender that we don't really have for race. It's not important for you as a human being who needs to go out and procreate and think like caveman times for you to have a race. You can have a sense of identity, you can have a sense of a tribe, and that could be race, but it's not as intrinsic as something like gender or sexuality. But hey, if there's a lot of research that came out, if I had meta-analysis after meta-analysis showing that transracial people have happier lives if they transition to be another race, I want people to be happy. And if the research told me that, I want to be consistent in what I believe, and I want happier people. So I guess I'll wait for the research on transracialism before I bite the bullet on that question.
I think that is the main difference, is that there's a very long historical precedent and scientific precedent for gender dysphoria. I keep going back to that because, again, trans is just an identity, but you don't have that same, maybe it's just not a topic heavily researched, but, transsexual people are a group of people that have been around for a very, very long time. So you have a community that's been around forever, and then you have Rachel Dolezal and like 3 other people. It's kind of like, I don't know.
Well, I would say, and I think from your point of view, Justin, I think I hear you saying that there is a body of scientific work that has been validated that shows this. I have read a lot of this work. I haven't read all of it. You probably have a bibliography to hand much better than I do. But from what I have read, I remember this from the 1990s when everybody was looking for the gay gene, when Simon LeVay was doing his big research, and then that didn't pan out. I've read many of these studies, and I'm not the final arbiter on them, but if you were to ask me my opinion, I would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't believe that there is all this settled science. I think a lot of it's controversial. I think a lot of it, to me, appears to be methodologically flawed, sometimes circular, and not well controlled. So there may be some in there, but I don't believe, and you may believe this, and other people may believe this, but no, I don't believe that this is settled science. I don't believe that science has shown that there is a thing called gender identity.
So I need to ask you, you kind of doubted the notion that it was biological. So I'll kind of ask you the same question that I ask a lot of people. If it isn't biological, what is it? What's the other option?
I think the other options, and there are many, it's not just one, but we know from looking around, we know from news reports, we know from some recent surveys and studies, especially with young people. And by the way, I'm not telling anybody how they have to live. It doesn't make any difference to me if somebody feels themselves more male or female. I am not in a dictatorial position. I'm just talking about what the truth of the matter is. There is a hugely high correlation in young people between having what we today call gender dysphoria issues and psychiatric comorbidities, and a very high correlation with neglectful or traumatic or abusive household upbringings. There's one study from the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine that found an 88% correlation between children who were diagnosed today with gender dysphoria and having multiple other psychiatric comorbidities that appeared to be based in attachment and trauma problems. It's not the whole answer. There's also autism. There's also social contagion. There are also, I think, many young kids who will turn out to be gay. I look at many of the kids today who say, I feel I have this gender identity, and I see myself in 1980 and 1981. I think it was a common experience for a lot of kids who grew up to be gay. So I think there are many different ones, not just one.
So I think there could be an explanation for gender identity that's sort of rooted in both social dynamics and in biology as well. I mean, I think what a lot of people mean when they talk about their gender identity, what they're really meaning is, you know, there's a combination of innate biological traits that you have that will cause you to be more masculine or feminine in your personality, in your preferences, in your behaviors. There's average differences between males and females on this. So by just your social interactions on the playground when you're a kid, you sort of realize if you're a little boy that you're more masculine in this sense, and you tend to just fit in with your, you know, your other, the kids, your friends who tend to be, who are males, who are boys. We do know that there is a correlation between homosexuality and being more gender nonconforming. So it's completely, you know, I think straightforward to think that if you're a really gender nonconforming child, if you're a really effeminate boy, you're gonna possibly have some level of dysphoria because your behaviors, your tendencies, you know, a combination of being innate and identifying where your behavioral traits sort of exist among your friends, among all the kids in your school. And you can kind of see where this could be sort of reified back into your mind as saying, oh, I can identify with these masculine traits of my other male friends, or I actually identify with the traits that I commonly see in girls. And I think a lot of that is just kids sort of recognizing their own personality based on you know, the cohort of the kids they see around them and where they sort of seem to fit in.
Well, this is the problem, the fact that we spent so much time just trying to define what exactly transgender is. And we're all adults on this stage who have probably read various literatures about this and really thought about this topic. I don't think we would have been chosen for this panel if we weren't all at least, you know, regularly reading about this stuff. So that's the kind of the problem when you bring it down to a child's level is like, yes, gender dysphoria is something you see in an extremely small percentage of population. Historically, it was young boys, now it's flipped to young girls, and we can talk about why that is. And you're right that there are, in a lot of these cases of kids now identifying, it's often linked, I think 45%, there's been a few studies that show that it's linked to a traumatic event, which to me, I don't think that that is the same thing. And I think the fact that we get so confused about what trans is, doctors are people, therapists are people, teachers are people, these kids' parents are people. So while it may be true that a very small fraction of these kids will grow up and, you know, live as a trans person, transition, maybe be all the better for it, I think that it is also true, and you can't deny that there are some people, and kids specifically, that are slipping into the cracks that would end up just being effeminate gay men, etc. A lot of the narratives of my childhood of liking certain things, behaving a certain way, are mirrored by gay men that I know. And the only difference is they kind of grew out of it, and mine persisted so intensely that I had to act on it, and it was a good thing to do. But yeah, there's kids falling through the cracks because we can't even cement the cracks for ourselves yet.
Well, since you brought it up, maybe this is a good question for the panel. Is Do you think rapid onset gender dysphoria, is that a new phenomenon? What is that? How is it different than what we used to know about gender dysphoria?
Yeah, so historically it's been studied that, it's, I think, 2 to 1 showing up in young males throughout history. And now it's flipped to 2 to 1 females to males. So, there's a lot of reasons why we can speculate that would be. I think social contagion is one aspect of it, not the entire story, but one part of it, because I think what you see is it popping up in a lot of friend groups, which doesn't seem so organic to me. I certainly didn't have people in my life as a kid that were also experiencing these things. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you're seeing cases of parents sometimes. There's a popular YouTube vlog channel called the Saucony Jolies, and the dad came out as trans, and then 6 months later, the 7-year-old kid comes out as trans and is now talking about blockers. And so I think that it can be taken on partly due to social contagion and just a lot of other things, like, it's showing up in populations of young girls that have eating disorders and body issues and cutting and that sort of stuff. And I think that there's some overlap there. But I don't think that any of that erases that there are actual trans people who feel that way from young, study it until they're older, make a choice as an adult and for themselves. And I think that that is still valid. And I think that there's just an explosion of consciousness about this issue right now, and people are talking about it more than literally ever. And so everyone's kind of just right and wrong at the same time about everything.
So rapid onset gender dysphoria doesn't seem to be a meaningfully consistent explanation for any of the things that we're seeing, especially the social contagion. So Lisa Littman, who is the author who originally came up with rapid onset gender dysphoria, came out with a follow-up study a few years ago with data that was collected around the same time. And in doing so, and I have to say, I don't think that study is worthless, but I do think it was heavily biased towards to get a certain narrative that she wanted to push. And even with that heavy bias, and even studying only detransitioners, only the people who are going to be most likely to have quote-unquote fallen victim to rapid onset gender dysphoria, she found that the vast majority of the detransitioners that she talked to did not have another trans person in their friend group. So if you say social contagion as in like, oh, I hang out with a lot of trans people, and that's what kind of made me want to be trans, and we've all made fun of cis people, this wasn't borne out in her own data. As far as like social influence, I think it would be dishonest to say that there's no social influence, but social influence doesn't have to be a bad thing. If we were born 70 years ago, I don't know if we would have come out as gay men. Or we would have the same biology coming into it. Of course, genes manifest themselves in an environment, so maybe we would have suppressed that a little bit more. But we might not have come out as gay. We might not have had that identity. It's good that we have gay role models. It's good that we have an ideology that we're pushing on our children, that it's fine to be gender nonconforming, and it's fine to turn out as gay or bi or pan. It's all that is fine. So social contagion doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing.
I think that social influence and social contagion, as you said, isn't necessarily an inherently negative thing. I agree. But the difference when we're talking about trans versus, you mentioned like gay, bi, pan, all that, is that trans is associated now with young teenagers and people who are not properly developed mentally making medical decisions for their bodies that are going to last a lifetime. So I think that that is the main difference. I understand why so many people get frustrated when you conflate gay and trans, because they are so different. If you have a 12-year-old going on puberty blockers that's never going to be able to bear children, it's like, yeah, you can say the influence wasn't necessarily bad, but that person still can't have kids because they were influenced as a kid.
And I would say, Justin, I think you're right. It's much less likely that we would have been able to come out as gay men 70 years ago before social mores changed, obviously.
Before social justice, right?
I'm sorry?
Before social justice, right? Woo!
Well, it depends on your view of social justice. I'm sure we could all find some brand of social justice we could get behind. I'm not behind the current one, but that doesn't mean I don't think there are some other ones that are good. But I don't see this as an unalloyed good at all. I think this is much more than having role models. I think that this is pressure that has become cult-like. And I think there's a very big difference between creating a world in which it is socially acceptable to be an effeminate boy or a tomboy or a butch girl. And I remember that world being created during my young years in the late 70s and the early 80s. I remember Free to Be You and Me. I remember when Legos were advertised in a unisex way. I remember when I came out very young in the late 80s. I remember that our goal, that I thought was our goal as gay people, was to bring us to this world where we said, you can be a sissy boy or a real tough girl. It doesn't mean you're not a real man. And what I see now, I don't see this as, oh, you can be this. If we were just talking about allowing children to dress the way they wanted and to have the mannerisms the way they wanted, that's fine with me. That's what I fought for. But we're saying now, oh, you're a boy who likes Madonna. You're a boy who likes to put on pink lipstick. You're not actually a boy. Maybe you're not a boy, and maybe you need to have your genitals worked on. I'm sorry, that's not a good.
I think if that's your understanding of gender affirmative healthcare, hold on. I think if that's your understanding of what gender affirmative healthcare looks like, you haven't looked at it at all. Do you think it's, yeah, I have too. Do you think it's that simplistic? So around the time that you came out, you said early 1980s, there was a book being published called The Sissy Boy Syndrome. That's an actual study, that's its actual title, and it's actually one of the studies that James Cantor came out with for his like desistance statistics. So yeah, it is good. No gender activist, no gender ideologue today would say, no, boys can't play with girly things and vice versa. No one would say that. So the fact that you think it's that easy, yeah, no, I mean, come on. Let me define my position. I think I can do it a little bit better than you. So gender affirmative healthcare does mean exploring all these gender nonconforming behaviors. Gender identity is not about your simple behaviors and preferences. It is deeper than that, and it is rooted in biology. And everything is rooted in biology because otherwise it would be cybernetic or supernatural. Those are the only places it can come from. They're going to manifest themselves in different environments, and I want to create an environment where kids are the most likely to be happy. I don't necessarily want a cis kid. I want a happy kid. And gender affirmative care says, hey, if you end up being cis, that's what makes you happy? Fantastic. You're trans, that's also fantastic. You're somewhere in the middle, you're non-binary, you're just fine being a gender non-conforming kid? Awesome. I want that happy kid, and I think the research supports me.
So I think there is like a defensible position that you can have that's, you can reasonably defend about certain safeguardings regarding kids being put on hormones or whatever. But there's also sort of these Bailey arguments, the ones that we see out in the public a lot more, and the ones we also see in the classroom, I think, too. I think a lot of the rapid onset gender dysphoria stuff we're seeing, which a lot of people think is part of that 4,000% spike we see in people claiming to be gender dysphoric. I think a lot of this, and I'll bring it back to something I said earlier, has to do with really the changing definitions that we have and that are commonly found in children's classrooms. Maybe not all children's classrooms. Maybe this isn't something you believe, but it's something that kids are receiving. They're receiving these lessons, that have something called the genderbread person on them. And when you look on the actual chart, it's this gingerbread-looking person, and it has, it's got like your biological sex. What is that? And then when it talks about your gender identity, it has manness and womanness on a sliding scale. And then the traits they have, and presumably this would include boyness and girlness for kids in a class. And the traits that they have on what determines whether you're more of a man or more of a woman or a girl or a boy are things like body hair and voice pitch, body shape, things like this that are, secondary sex characteristics, the characteristics we get when we go through puberty, but these aren't necessarily what define being a boy or a girl or a male or a female. So this is what kids are receiving, okay? They're receiving lessons like this, and those are rooted in not just sort of stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, but also anatomical features that they have. So you can get, so the takeaway message from a lot of these that a little girl might see going through puberty is, I don't have large breasts. Does that make me less of a female, less of a woman? These are the kind of messages that I think a lot of kids are getting in their classrooms. I have parents send these to me all the time saying, this is what my kid brought home. We have EGAL that's defining being trans as whether or not you behave according to what society expects based on what's between your legs. I mean, the take-home message for a kid is clearly just going to be, I'm not stereotypically masculine, therefore I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. These are the ways that kids are thinking about these things. I think there are more defensible ways to talk about them, but I think this is broadly the message that a lot of kids are getting, which I think is responsible for this, the huge spike in gender dysphoria or purported gender dysphoria that we're seeing.
This is why, as much as I'm really not trying to downplay you guys' experience of coming out and being gay and from the generations that you guys are, but the trans thing is just so different. And I feel like there's such a different ethical conversation to be had about 12-year-olds getting surgery, about 12-year-olds being on blockers and having health complications for the rest of their life. And if they're lucky, no complications, but they're still medicalized for the rest of their life. When you're trans, you have to take hormones forever. You do not stop. I don't know, we don't really know what happens when you start that at 12 or 13. You can list all the possible, problems with Lupron and different medications, but, the plastic surgery clinic that I used for my entire transition is located in Plano, Texas, which is a suburb here in Dallas. And I was there recently supporting my friend who was getting surgery, and they told me that due to the new laws in Texas banning kids from getting surgeries, they were having to turn a bunch of patients down. Some of them as young as 12 years old who were getting double mastectomies. That's breast removal. That is permanent. That is not reversible through any other means other than implants, which are not breasts. So I think when you have kids that are altering their bodies forever, the conversation is just so different, and you have to take ethics into consideration.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, of course. So the reason I'm comparing gay and trans is because, from a social movement perspective, there are some similarities, but of course, your sexuality is going to be different than your gender identity, and that could possibly, gender identity might possibly lead to some sort of medicalization. You know what y'all's problem is on that whole topic? You haven't gone woke enough. All right? You got to talk to the super woke gender activists who say you can look anyway, act anyway, and your gender identity is just what you feel. You haven't gone woke enough. That's your problem. No, but I do think that it is a good conversation to talk about and the nuances of it. All of us want better research. All of us want more scientifically informed answer. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But we're not going to get there if we have half the conversation being, is gender identity real? No, we have to move past that. It is real. It's absolutely real. So now let's talk about what we do with that information. We can't have this information about hey, maybe there's this organization who's putting out an ultra-simplistic, confusing, and probably scientifically incorrect version of a video to kids explaining gender identity. We can talk about that, but we also need to talk about how Florida is saying that no, you shouldn't socially transition your kid at all, despite the fact that that is what the research says is the best. And that's not even medicalization. It's not going to hurt to let a kid socially transition, but they're blocking that from the conversation. I want the best evidence. I want the best way forward. I want the most scientifically informed position that is going to help the most kids and adults be happy, and we have to come somewhere in the middle here.
So I just recently learned that Sweden and Finland have both taken steps to ban gender reassignment surgery for anyone until they're 18 years old. And also the clinic, the Karolinska Hospital recently ended the practice of prescribing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to gender dysphoric patients who are under the age of 18. Are we behind the curve? Is that something that you could agree with other people on this panel about when it comes to children? Or do you believe, are you still waiting for more evidence?
The vast preponderance of the evidence that I've seen on puberty blockers says that they are, when prescribed correctly, of course, if they're prescribed incorrectly, they're going to have harmful effects, but when prescribed correctly, they do have favorable impacts on gender dysphoria, and they do potentially have negative side effects, but I think...
With children, though?
Children.
Yeah, that's obviously where you're talking
How
about
do you
with puberty
prescribe
blockers.
Lupron correctly for children for puberty? What is the way to correctly prescribe a chemical that artificially blocks the puberty of a child? How do you prescribe that correctly?
By talking to the psychiatrist, talking to their endocrinologist, talking to their gender-affirming team, and seeing if this is the best option forward for this individual child. That's how you do it. You do it because the evidence says that it helps the kid.
So there are times when it is appropriate, medically correct, and wise to stop a otherwise healthy and normal child from developing gonads, from developing secondary sex characteristics, and possibly from developing brain tissue. You think that there's a time that this is correctly done?
Absolutely, because I listen to what the research says.
That's surprising.
I'd also like to say that I've known a lot of trans women in my life. So there's a conversation that no offense, you guys can have from outside the community, and I can have it having lived in it. And there are a lot of people that I know that transitioned from blockers and hormones at a very young age and had major complications with their surgeries, because if you do not, this is graphic, but if you do not develop a sizable penis, you cannot turn it into a vagina. So if you are blocking puberty, you will not develop a penis that is substantial enough, this sounds crazy, to turn into a vagina surgically. So even for trans people that, yes, it may reverse their dysphoria, you're also signing them up for so much more. It comes down to, again, the ethics of, do you believe, I'm just putting out there for all of you guys, not anyone in particular, do you believe a 12-year-old can decide to be sterilized for life. I don't think if you took the word trans out of it, any sane person would say yes, but suddenly you put the word trans in it, and yes, 12-year-old Timmy can decide he never wants to have kids because he wants to be a girl. It's fucking it's insane, sorry.
It is insane.
I'm going to go to one of the other reasons this has been in the news a lot lately, and I think for the most part, we seem to all agree, at least when it comes to adults, everybody's cool with people living how they want to live, as long as it doesn't impede on your rights, right? I think, are we all in agreement on that? So recently, this came into the news, though, because in March, Leah Thomas became the first trans woman to win women's NCAA, did I get that right, sports people, championship in swimming. Should trans women be allowed to compete in sports with biological women?
If they've gone through puberty, no. And that's the difference. I mean, there are people who we've been talking about transition before or during, and I think that it's a bit different. But by and large, especially when it comes to adults, Leah Thomas is a very classic example of someone who should not have been competing against women. You know, it's weird because suddenly you have to like really care about like women's sports, and it's like not something I typically care about. I'm not trying to be offensive, I just don't. But I think that a lot of people support it just based on not wanting to be seen as someone who's unfair or excluding people. But the problem with that is obviously women are being hurt by that, at least women athletes, which again, it's not billions of people, but it's probably millions. So it's one of those situations that's not super black and white. I mean, you can have, I'm sure, a shitty trans woman athlete. It's not like it's always going to be someone she-hulking out, but it's more often going to be.
Yeah, so my stance on this, it really is a social question of whether we think that females should be able to have their own leagues to be able to compete in sports fairly. There's no rule written on the moon that says this is what we have to do. I happen to think that female athletes should have their own leagues and events where they can compete without biological males competing in them. And so once you say that, once you say, I think that females should have their own leagues free of males, then you have to say, okay, well, it's by definition exclusionary. And then you have to have your criteria of like, well, what are we going to exclude? And, you know, you can exclude biological males from this category. The history of sports right now, the reason we have men's and women's sports, and I do think a lot of gender ideology has gone in here and said that, well, men and women are these social categories now based on femininity and identity and masculinity and all this stuff. But really, they were put in place because of the sex differences between males and females. And that really can't be ignored. So people who say they think that males should be able to compete in female sports, I mean, they're just saying that females shouldn't have their own leagues. They don't think that's a value that we should have. I happen to just disagree with that. If we want women to be able to compete fairly, there needs to be rules for exclusion, because if you don't have them, then it's no longer female sports.
Why do we have sex categorization in sports?
Because going through male puberty makes you a better athlete than
Makes you a
not
better
going through
athlete.
male puberty.
Correct.
Yep.
Yes. I very much agree that we should still have this categorization. There are actual physical reasons, and we should have this categorization. And I'm going to get canceled on the lefts. Okay, see, I'm with you all. I do think that just identifying as a gender is not enough to be able to compete with your gender that you feel. That's not enough to like compete in the women's league. However, the reason we have this sex categorization in the first place is not just because men are better athletes, is not just because men are bigger. The reason is because pound for pound, men can be bigger and they can rather be stronger than women because they can put on more lean body mass, more contractile tissue than women can at the same body weights. That is the reason that this sex categorization exists. And this can be addressed because the main reason that men typically have a lot more lean body mass than women, the main reason for that is the increased protein synthesis that they get from those higher rates of testosterone. And with hormone replacement therapy, it seems, I want more research to come out, it seems to be able to pull that lean body mass down to something that is comparable when they are put with height-matched cis control groups. I think that we can, with more research, find the best possible answer to make everyone happy and with fair competition for everyone.
So there's currently 2 large meta-analyses, these review papers. They came out in, I think, either 2020 or 2021, These are longitudinal studies, so they actually look at individuals before transition and after. First, it goes in and it quantifies the sex differences between males and females in a various things like lifting weights, throwing a baseball, things like that. The average disparity between males and females is about 30%, okay, when this is averaged out. The current studies we have, and maybe more data will come in that shows these aren't correct, but based on all available data from two review papers, the first author of one of them was a trans woman herself, showed that after 3 years of taking cross-sex hormones, that 30% gap is only diminished by about 5%. Okay, so there's still a big 25% gap between males and females. And so really just based on the current data that we have, it shows that it's just still completely unfair. And taking testosterone, if taking like a puberty blocker or cross-sex hormones, this doesn't just make you weaker. Like a female isn't just like a weaker man. They're taller, they have larger bones, they have connective tissues that are larger. And most of this stuff, your hand size, these things don't go away when you start taking cross-sex hormones. And these are absolutely part of the male advantage we see across different sporting
We do not have height categories because height is an advantage in some sports, but it is not deemed a significant advantage enough to warrant categorical separation. There's a reason we have weight categories in certain sports, but not height categories, because weight is a proxy for lean body mass, contractile tissue. The study that I think you're referencing, one of them, the one by Lisa Lippman, it did make a lot of these comparisons, but it made some, I think, pretty dishonest framing when they compared cis reference control groups versus trans women. It compared gross lean body mass. They had a lot more lean body mass than the cis reference groups, but they were also quite a bit taller, and taller people have more lean body mass. You have to match these control groups. You have to match these groups.
They've been matched.
They have been matched, and one of the studies that they did that, they saw that when you actually match for height, because again, taller people have more sarcomeres and series, they have more lean body mass. When you match them for height, the difference becomes much, much, much smaller than when you just use gross measures of lean body mass. It is close. I want more data. These were on untrained individuals, so I want to see what it looks like in practice.
That was a study by Debbie, I can't remember the trans woman who did that study. I'm talking about the two review papers that collected all of these. It's Emma Hilton did those ones.
I'm sorry, I messed up.
Yeah.
Emma Hilton and Lisa Lippman. That was my bad.
And you can do the math by looking at how, if you control for body weight and height and all these things, still that 30% gap only diminishes about 5%, and even controlling for your height and your weight doesn't close that entire gap between males and females. So, I would say just based on the current evidence we have,
I think we all kind of agree we're just splitting hairs, right? We all kind of agree, right?
Splitting hairs is where you get the nuanced best answers.
True.
There's another area of public policy that's come under scrutiny, and that's what we do with transgender prisoners. Do they go to the prison for male or female? What do you guys think about that? I personally have mixed feelings about this, so I'm curious what everyone thinks about it.
You don't put penises and vaginas in a jail cell. That's pretty much simple.
There's something, and it's not the major topic of this panel, but I think it's something that I would ask everybody to tuck in the back of their minds and let it roll over in your minds over the next couple of days. There's a big problem that not this conversation, but this conversation is not acknowledging. And that problem is mental health. And specifically, the number of people who have personality styles and mental styles that are engrossingly narcissistic, emotionally unstable, pathologically dishonest, predatory people. Predatory people are taking advantage of the designation trans, whether or not they're, quote, really trans or really believe it. We don't even need to ask this question. Leah Thomas is a perfect example. I don't know Leah Thomas. I can't diagnose Leah Thomas's mind, but I've been around long enough and I know what I see in patterns, and I see the same pattern here. Leah Thomas is a man who thinks very highly of himself, who realized that if he called himself a woman, that nobody was going to be able to stop him at his height and his muscular build from doing what he did. And we are watching a lot of people who any honest person who is not afraid to tell the truth can look and say, this is a narcissistic liar taking advantage of gaps in our safeguarding, and we are acting like we can't see it, and we need to start talking about it.
So you think it's more reasonable? Leah Thomas is better explains, in your opinion, that it's a man who wanted to cheat at swimming to achieve all the fame and glory of women's collegiate swimming, and he's willing to go through a bunch of hormone therapy, change his body. I don't know about you. It wouldn't. No, I'm using your language here, because you. Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm using your language. I respect language. So, going through all this changes in their body, because it is a she. Yep. Call Leah Thomas she, please. No. So you will not. Okay, so you were lying when you said we all respect and we can all live with each other. But what I was saying, it's more likely that this person has just cheated to get all the glory of women's collegiate swimming than it was just a swimmer who actually was trans.
That is what I'm saying.
That's nonsense.
I think it's somewhere in the middle here. I think that it's probably someone, and this is just from observing the story, who perhaps does feel trans, whether that's relevant or not. It depends on the person looking at the story, but it's also someone who fails to recognize their own reality. I think that you can be trans without going and stepping on people's toes about it. I think Leah Thomas should have automatically known it wasn't fair, just based on everything you can visually see and then all the science we've discussed on the stage. So I think Leah is trans, but really fucking selfish, same time.
I think it's...
Do you not believe there are any predators who take advantage of where we're at socially?
Of course. Why do you need to punish all the people who aren't predators to accommodate for them? What happens to the trans women who go to the male prison?
I'm sorry, I can't understand.
What happens to the trans women who go to the male prison?
Goes to what?
What happens to the trans women who have to go to a male prison?
First of all, a trans woman, I don't think in most circumstances should be in a men's prison. I don't think this is a good idea for either of the sexes that are in that prison. Am I misunderstanding your question?
So where do they go?
Pardon?
Where does a trans woman go?
That's a public policy question, but it's not the women's prison.
LGBT wards, it's probably the smartest decision, because
Regardless of what we decide, the answer is not the women's prison, in my opinion.
So I think it's probably important not to focus on particular, what are Leah Thomas's intentions? What is the intentions of this one criminal who happens to be, who went into a female prison and raped somebody? I think these are just, we can argue about someone's intentions, but you don't know the content of someone's mind. I would just focus on the fact that there needs to be certain safeguardings, because there are people who will take advantage of loopholes, and these are the loopholes that we need to make sure we can close beforehand so that these types of people just don't have free reign in these areas. To me, that just seems like the logical area to focus on, not what are Leah Thomas's intentions. Are they consciously cheating? Is this male going into a prison, or do they just want to go in there so they can take advantage of women? What we need to focus on is making sure the safeguards are there so that it doesn't matter what their intentions are. They're not going to be able to get there in the first place regardless. So I think that's where we need to focus.
Before we open it up for questions from the audience, I wanted to ask the hardest question. How do you define woman?
An adult human female.
I mean, I'm genuinely asking.
Yeah, an adult human female, where female can mean someone with a gender identity that is opposite of male.
That's where
Merriam-Webster.
That's where I will veer away from that, because, to me, from a biological background, male and female, these are terms that have definite meanings. Initially, maybe 2010 era, so long ago now, I think many of us were asked to make this distinction between male and female and being a man or a woman, and that being a male or female, this was biology. Being a man or woman, well, that's gender identity. And I was largely on board with all of that. In hindsight, maybe that was the beginning of the slippery slope that has now led to where we are now, where people are saying, no, I don't just identify as the opposite. gender, man or woman. I'm actually identifying as the opposite sex itself, and my identity defines my sex. That is where I started standing up and talking about this, because that's where the boundary between identity and biology was completely broken down. And that's something that I won't let get broken down.
So I don't think that biologists or any kind of scientist, I don't think when they're starting their research, when they're beginning to conduct their study, they go look for basic terms in the dictionary. I don't think that that's a reasonable concern. I don't think Merriam-Webster defining woman or female a certain way is going to be that much of an issue. What I do take umbrage with is that, I don't think that when people say, trans women are women, they're not saying that trans women have XX chromosomes. They're not saying trans women produce large immobile gametes. I don't think that's what they're saying. So I don't see where this threat to biology comes from by including trans women under the broader definition of woman.
So I think I think the consequences are what we've talked about today. People like Leah Thomas competing in sports that are clearly designed for female athletes, going to prisons that are defined, clearly set aside for females. I think a large, cultural conversation we have of, sex being blurred and we're telling people that you can identify your way into a sex category. I think that is eroding a lot of different areas where sex actually matters. We mentioned sports, we mentioned things like prisons. So I think that's an example of why, if we want to define a woman as adult human female, I think this is sort of the definition we've had from a long time, with the understanding that being a woman primarily requires you to be a female first, and then, an adult human after that. So, we can talk about what woman should mean in different contexts, but I don't think we should be erasing of what the intent is in things like women's prisons and women's sports that are clearly not designed based on just your identity.
The reason those things are designed are to protect people. The reason we have men's and women's prisons is presumably to keep them protected. So I want to see some research about who is going to be the most protected. Yeah, close loopholes that allow prisoners to say, oh, I suddenly feel like a woman. I don't think that would meaningfully happen. I think that would be pretty obvious. But also, let's see what the research says. I don't want to send. You only have two options in most cases. You're going to go to a men's prison or a women's prison. And for right now, I want to see the trans women. If they go to the male prison, they're going to get assaulted. Almost for sure. I think we can all agree that is a high likelihood of happening. So until we figure that out, until we see what the best option is, let them go to the women's prison. That's where a lot of them already go, and I want to see what the data comes out on that. Are they more violent than the cis prisoners? Are they more likely to cause problems? And is that what is the trade-off that we're willing to make for the other way, which is definitely the trans women are going to be assaulted a lot in prison?
Well, I would say we have. What about the women? Yeah. I mean,
that's what I'm talking about. The trans women and the cis women and everyone in between. That's what I'm talking about. I want all of them to be safe.
Don't play sophistry with me. What about? I'm as concerned as you are about anybody being assaulted. But what I'm not hearing from you is, and you don't have to, but maybe you forgot. So you don't want to see them assaulted, so let them go to the women's prison until we can figure it out. What about the women who are in prison? What about the two women in New Jersey's Delamana prison right now who are impregnated? I don't even know if it was a sexual assault case, but there are many cases of fully genitally intact males calling themselves trans women who are being put into women's prison, and there have been cases of assault, and some of them are psychosexual predators. If we care about that, what do we do for the women in there?
You separate the psychosexual predators from the general population like you do in prison already.
But even if it's not an issue of sexual predation, again, I said it so simply earlier because it really is that simple. You put a penis and a vagina in a cell and someone's in there for years, they're going to make babies. That's what's going to happen. So I don't think that it should just be they shouldn't be in the men's prison, which I agree, because that's obviously dangerous, but I don't think the default should be just a throwaway, they go in the women's then, to cause problems there. I think the solution is LGBT wards, and maybe we have to have a conversation about funding for that, but maybe government spending our money on every fucking thing else, why not just set up somewhere where everyone's safe and happy, or as safe and happy as you can be in prison?
I'll add to that. I'm not sure it's true that we need to just sort of pretend that we don't have any reasons to believe that something could go wrong by introducing trans women to female prisons, knowing what we know about males in general, and trans women, they're biologically male. And what's the reason we don't let people who just identify as men? Like, why shouldn't I go to a women's prison as well? There's no data that says I'm going to do anything, but we know, based on trends in males and females, that females have more to be concerned about in prison, from males being in there than vice versa. So this idea that like we just have to get data on whether trans women are actually a threat. I mean, we know that males are going to be more of a threat on average, and so this idea that we just don't
Do we know
have
that
no
trans
reason to think
women?
a problem could happen.
Do we
I
know
don't
that
think that's
trans
true.
women are a representative sample of males? That's an assumption that you're making that seems very unscientific.
We don't know if they're a representative sample, but I don't think the idea should be, well, just throw them in and see what happens. I mean, we have reason based on what we know about males to say from a position of some evidence that
So let's make
maybe
fewer
we
and fewer
should.
assumptions, gather data, and do what the data says.
But that data gathering requires just throwing males into female prisons and just seeing what happens, what sticks to the wall. I think there's reasons that females, even if there wasn't an increased threat, maybe they're just embarrassed. They don't want to be undressing or sharing spaces with a biological male. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why we could just say that, we have female prisons, we have male prisons. There's plenty of reasons why we wouldn't want any cross-pollination going on in there because, there's potential elevated threat levels. There's just the dignity of being around, a male if you don't want to undress around them. I just think there's plenty of reasons we have.
I'm going to give it to Blaire.
Part of this is this insistence on conflating trans women and women. They have to be the exact same thing. It's like this ideological fight rather than people just recognizing what reality is. It puts no sorrow or misery in my heart to know that you and I, Carrie, are different in many ways, trans being one of them. We don't have to have the same lane. We don't have to live the exact same lives and have the same experiences. Trans women are different than women, and that is a fact because they had to trans to become that. It's different. So the idea that one side thinks that the hill to die on is trans women or women, period, no nuance, nothing else, no further discussion, is wrong. It's not helping anyone, and it's creating situations like this.
So I can come in the middle on that, all right? So let's talk to me since I can't answer for all the SJWs out there. Yeah, trans women are different than women, of course. Of course that is the case. That's why you're right, that's why you had to transition. But on the other side of that, I don't think it's fair to say that trans women are the same as males. All right? That's why I asked you, are trans women a representative sample of males? All right? You're not the same as cis women, and they're not the same as cis men either. All right? We can acknowledge that there are differences, and we can discuss the nuances rather than just simple platitudes like penis, vagina separate. All right? Maybe there's a little bit more to it than that.
So if we can give a round of applause for all of our panelists, we're going to open it up for questions. I'm sure that you guys have... I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions. We've got a microphone set up over here with Fritz, if you guys want to line up.
All right, thank you. Please keep your questions brief, no long-winded life stories.
Do we have any evidence or studies on gender confusion or gender, and I'm not talking about just some occasional, homo activity, but gender confusion among other animals, other creatures? Dogs, cats, or monkeys, or whatever.
So I don't think, well, it depends on how you define gender. So there are some biologists who will define gender just as the basic differences in behaviors and preferences between between males and females of a species. So we see like gendered behavior, but in order to know if there's like dysphoria or something going on there, if they have identities, this isn't something I think we can really ask scientifically, because you can't have them fill out forms and give you coherent responses that way. But we do see sex atypical behaviors, across different species. So we'll see certain male animals who are behaving more female typical and vice versa. Like dogs that go around.
So I just want to thank all the wonderful panelists up here for being here today. I know you guys are enjoying this, so appreciate you guys. For the gentleman on the left here, all the information that I've seen, you claim that you care about what makes people happy and the well-being of human beings. Can you reconcile how years ago that we saw that there were extremely high suicide rates among transgender identifying people? It was close to 40% at one time. Now, since society has made such great strides in being accepting of people who are transgender or identify as an opposite gender than what they were born as, that number, the information that I've seen is that number has actually increased over time. Can you reconcile that?
Sure. When you said the transgender suicide rate was 40%, right? All right.
That's the number that I've...
Okay, well, that is incorrect. That's from a UCLA survey. And as far as I'm aware, with data collection practices, people who have committed suicide don't answer surveys. So that was an attempt rate. And contained within that study are people who are treated better, tend to... All right, here's the biggest predictor of suicidality, is connectedness. Belongingness, and other words that are hard for me to say. How much do you connect?
They're more accepted now.
They are more accepting now, all right? And things have gotten better for people with gender dysphoria. They absolutely have. Now, all of us, I think, in the past couple of years, may have had some mental health issues. Trans people are not just their transness, all right? They have to deal with COVID. They had to experience isolation separate from them being trans. But all the data suggests that affirming their identities, creating an affirming environment, creating a supportive environment, drastically lowers their incidence of suicidality, drastically increases their feelings of well-being. It is arguably good for trans people to keep in that societal acceptance going up rather than calling them males and refusing to respect how they identify.
Okay.
So I think the one of the main issues is really, it's not really an inclusion issue, it's really an anti-straight issue going on, especially in the classroom. For example, I saw this chart that was given out to elementary school kids where it's a 0 and it's straight, and then it's 10 to you're gay. And as you go up and up the chart, it gets more rainbow. So having students psychologically be attracted to color and not gray, do you think it really has an anti-straight issue going on inside the classrooms than really an inclusion and the teachers saying, yes, there are gay people, there are trans people, you respect that? If you want more, ask your parents, rather than an anti-straight movement where it's 0 to 10 and then it gets more rainbow as it goes on?
I think there is a tendency for all the sort of roads and social forces to be pushing people to be not just boring cis straight people like me. We constantly see this celebrations of people coming out as trans or coming out as gay, but we don't see similar celebrations if maybe they were to say, oh, actually no, I'm actually not trans anymore, or just kidding, I'm straight. It tends to be, actually shame tends to be more common response to those types of people. I did see a thing going around that had all the different flags for different gender identities. I don't know if I can't really verify it, but it was supposedly from a classroom thing, and you could select, what flag are you? And it had like the trans flag, and it had all these different ones. They're all colorful and cool. And then the cisgender one was just like shades of gray. And if you have like kids that are pointing out like, what are you? Like, who's gonna pick the cisgender? Like, I wouldn't want to pick it. Like, yeah.
I think there's also a really huge segment of the population right now that is sort of restructuring social hierarchy based on these identities. So that's why you see straight white men at the bottom, black trans women are above white trans women, gay men are below them. So I think that's just the way a lot of people are thinking about the world right now, which is obviously incorrect. Maybe not obviously to some people, but I think it's incorrect.
The status quo lacks saliency. You don't have to come out as a straight person. You don't have to come out as a cis person. It's assumed. All right? I have to come out as gay every time I meet a new person and they ask me to explain the wedding ring. All right? Status quo lacks saliency. They don't have to come out. They don't have to be celebrated because there was never any reason for them to not exist.
That's true, but I think a lot of kids see the celebration of coming out and identifying as a certain thing, and maybe they're kids that are not so celebrated in their life and they want that, So I think that's just one other reason in a long list of things that I think could be confusing kids and pushing them to identify.
That's true, but I also would like to admit that there's a lot of transphobia and homophobia out there still. Kids see that as well, and it's just as important, probably more important, for us to reassure those kids and tell their peers. Gay pride's not just for queer kids; it's also for straight kids who will be their peers and shouldn't make fun of them. So maybe it's also really important to make sure that we are countering trans and homophobia, queerphobia in general.
I think this whole topic's so geographical too. Like, it literally just depends where you live. So I have a lot of friends in LA that have kids in the school system, and the way you say that they see a lot of transphobia and homophobia, not really. Like, in LA, it's not really like that. There's a much different culture. If there's a kid growing up in the Bible Belt, for sure, and that's 100% the point. But I don't know, I have a lot of parents in LA that reach out and say there's like 6 trans kids in my school and they're all being pushed to identify this way. So it depends where you live. I don't think you really see the hatred if you live in certain parts of the country.
I kind of have a 2-part question. Are y'all familiar with Dr. John Money and the Reimer twin experiment? And to that point, him saying that gender identity is a social construct and it is an idea of nature versus nurture. I know you kind of alluded to it's kind of a combination of both, but can you give like a good critique of maybe why it being a social construct is not a good thing?
Oh, yes. So I hate the term social construct, not because it's not useful, but because everyone doesn't know what it means. And on all sides of this, all right? No one knows what social construct means. The left thinks that like social construct means it's completely arbitrary, it's not based on anything, and the right thinks kind of the same thing. So a social construct is just how genes manifest themselves in an environment, all right? It's how our brains respond to this. We're biologically social. So in the John Monnet experiments, I think it's Monet, right? Monet, or is it actually Money? Money, okay. I'll try to make it fancier for him. So yeah, he's had this like idea that gender was a blank slate. It was all socially imposed. None of it was based in any sort of biology, which is obviously what the opposite of what I'm arguing. And they had a kid, a little boy with a botched circumcision, and they raised him as a girl. And that boy developed what is inarguably described as gender dysphoria, because it is based on the brain. He wasn't conforming to stereotypes in terms of his behaviors, but there was something far, far deeper than that, and that was what was causing the distress. So I think that's a great example of how gender dysphoria can manifest itself based on a guy whose research isn't talked about because he was kind of really, really wrong.
I also happen to have a 2-part question. So specifically for you, just to lead up, do you immediately affirm a kid's decision to go trans?
I talk to them. I want to see what they're talking about.
Okay.
That's what you do with any sort of like psychiatrist. That's what you do with any sort of like gender affirming care. You talk to them, see what see what's going on, see why they feel that way.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was just going to say the problem with that is there's so many therapists right now that are pushed for affirm only and are, at risk of losing their job and being discredited as professionals because they don't affirm or being seen as transphobic or hateful. That goes for a lot of surgeons as well. So we keep removing not the boundaries, but the prerequisites to being trans and it statistically being a good decision to transition because we're having these therapists that have to affirm these kids or they get fired or they get, slandered.
To be clear, gender affirming doesn't mean automatically, oh, you say you're a girl? I guess that's 100% true. Let's get you some puberty blockers. No, there's a little bit more to it than that. The opposite of gender affirming would be like what is called gender confrontation or gender repairing. So automatically affirm, I say listen to them and use the language they want you to use, but continue to talk to them, and because this is a very complex subject.
The second question would be, why not at least try to affirm their biological gender first?
Because that's part of gender affirmative care. Ask them why they feel this way. It's not an either-or situation. You can do both. The important thing is to talk to the kid.
Hello, thank you guys for coming. Blaire, you're more lovely in person than even on your YouTube videos, so absolutely. I guess for all of the liberal parents who want parent rights, like saying that you want to affirm your child's gender at 4 years old and say that they're trans, or say you're a conservative parent who wants the right to say that I do not want to have gay, trans curriculum discussions in the 3rd grade. Where do parents come together or should come together to have full rights of whatever that they want to do, or where do those rights end as a conservative parent or as a liberal parent?
I don't think the rights end at all. I think your kids are your kids, and any teacher or school system that's trying to take ownership over your kids is some communist bullshit. So the state does not own your children. I don't think your rights end at all. I think that's my point.
I would argue just for greater school transparency, just so the parents know what's going on, and if it's something that does not sit right with them, they can see that and they can remove their kids from a school if that doesn't sit right with them.
I have a question for you three. All right. A big argument against like the gender ideology in schools is that you don't want states imposing an ideology on children. And while I think that's a very disingenuous claim, I think it brings up an interesting question. All right, a kid, let's see, second grade kid. All right, so what is that? 7 years old, shows up. Last year in first grade, they identified as a boy, and now they identify as a girl in second grade. What does the teacher do? What pronouns do they use for this child who is now identifying as a girl?
I think they should ask the parents what they would want their kids.
Parents are supportive.
What was that?
The parents are supportive.
Then I would ask that, if the teacher agrees with the ideology and wants to use those pronouns, then I think they would be able to. But I don't think we should have compelled speech on the teachers to use.
Okay, so if the teacher refuses, can we agree they refuse to use these kids' new pronouns? That is an actor of the state. That is a state employee imposing their ideology onto that child. Can we have some reciprocation?
I think it's more of a lack of participation.
Against compelled speech, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's more of a lack of participation in the ideology, not imposing a new one on the kid.
How about they intentionally, this is a little trans girl, they intentionally call the kid he, as intentional. Does that constitute?
I mean, anyone who's purposely trying to go against or hurt a child is a piece of shit in any direction, but I think that it's whatever the parents want at the end of the day, and the teacher should abide by what the parents want.
I just say this really quickly. I'm hearing, and I get that we're on the other side of this, but I'm hearing a lot of this definite, this is a trans child, you should use the language they want, use the language they want. No. I don't believe that because a child says this is what I want, that creates a moral parenting duty on us to do exactly what they want. I think we have to negotiate these things, and I think there are going to be different, I don't even know the answer to, I don't know what I would say to your question, but yes, I know you think that's very troublesome. I can see that. But I don't think we should be led by children. I'm sorry, and I don't think that that's crazy.
Thank you for being here, but doesn't this kind of come down to a discussion of self-actualization and really what we, like the way that we view ourselves and coming to some understanding of our place in the world? And the reason I'm asking that is because does it help to use terms like happy as the ultimate goal for our existence here on the planet? Like, isn't that one of the conflicts here, is that we assume that, like in Blaire's condition, is she happier because of the transition, or is she more fulfilled, and happiness comes from that fulfillment? Like, the reason I'm saying that is because it could be happy for some kids to be affirmed, and then non-affirming others would create happiness for them. It just depends on your position of what happiness is.
Yeah, it's complex.
I know, but
ask them, talk to them, see what's going to work best for each individual child. Go beyond just, are you happy or not? That's why you have a psychiatrist. That's why you have an entire team of people who are going to talk to you, psychologists, understanding where you're coming from. So we can figure out, what does happy mean? What can that mean to this kid? And they can talk to you. So.
Hi, Blaire. So I just want to come here and say Shane Dawson didn't do anything wrong. I'm just kidding. So I'm not sure if this is common knowledge or not, but data says that the human brain stops developing at age 25, and I know that for a fact because I'm 27, and yeah, I'm going to. So I was thinking legislators were onto something when they raised the drinking age from 18 to 21, and I think we should start thinking in the same way when it regards to transitioning. I was thinking, like, would it be beneficial for the trans community as a whole to delay the transitioning process to at least 21 and maximum 25?
I don't know. It's so difficult because that's also another geographical question. It's like 16 as an adult in some places, 18 other places, and then all of a sudden you can't, drink until you're 21. But I think 18 is generally where I feel the safest because at 18 you can get any other kind of surgery. You can go and seek any other type of medication. So for me, 18 feels safe, but I am aware that it's like a very nuanced question. And yeah, at 18 your brain isn't fully developed, but I mean, you have the legal rights to do so many other things. Why not surgery? I don't know.
Hello. I would like to thank you, sir, on the far left for coming and to expressing your ideas here. It's very beneficial. We want to make sure that we don't, stay in an echo chamber and that our ideas are challenged a little bit. The other thing, a question I want to ask you is, are you aware of what actual Lupron is? The drug Lupron, are you aware of what it is?
No.
Okay, Josh, can you please define what Lupron is used for as far as rapists and stuff like that's concerned? Thank you.
Blaire might be better. Well, Lupron is a drug that is used, I believe, to treat some prostate cancers. I believe it may also sometimes be used to treat severe endometriosis. I don't remember what it's FDA approved for, but it's a very strong drug that is not supposed to be used, if I remember correctly, for more than 6 months in some cases because of its long-term effects. And it has the effect of literally stopping the puberty if you give it to a child before their puberty happens. So it's a very hardcore drug. You may know more about it.
It is used to treat cancer, and there are no long-term studies on what a person's life and health profile looks like having gone through that at 12, 13, 14, the ages where they take them, and how that affects them long-term. So that's another reason why there are so many ethical questions to be raised, because in many ways these kids are guinea pigs. We don't know what it's like to have a kid on these medications for life and go into adulthood yet.
And we never will if we outlaw this kind of treatments. So do you want to know what the actual answers would be? Do you want to know what the actual
That's true,
long-term
but again, so the good line for me is do you think a 12-year-old can decide to sterilize themselves? To me, at the conversation, I don't know why enough people don't bring that aspect of it up. To me, that's just the line. Can you decide to not have children for the rest of your life at age 12? I don't think any child can.
And I think it should be done in a controlled setting with some trials. It's not just let's just unleash it on the whole population first and then see what happens.
What about what they do to rapists and stuff like that?
Oh, actually, yes. Historically, it was used to chemically castrate pedophiles as well.
This is the chemical that you know as chemical castration that used to be done to sex offenders. I don't know. Was it Lupron? Alan Turing was chemically castrated?
Yes, it was used to castrate pedophiles.
Guys.
It's used to treat cancer, castrate pedophiles, and stop puberty. Again, using it for more than 6 months can raise a lot of problems. Like you said, it needs to be in controlled settings, not, okay, this is the roadmap for the entire population that comes in and expresses gender dysphoria, which, by the way, a lot of fucking kids grow out of. I'm so sorry I swore, but a lot of them grow out of it, and you're removing their body parts and sterilizing themselves before they have a chance to.
All right. I just wanted to thank you all for coming to Texas. It's my first time being into an event like this. It's my dress like this. I didn't know what to wear. But I wanted to go back to the same-sex prisons to kind of keep control on male prisons where you don't have a transgendered male or a male to female trans woman in a male prison. And I just wanted to understand, are we not ascribing the same logic to eunuchs? Because to me, those are also emasculated men. Sorry. Those are also emasculated men that, would be more prone to a sexual assault inside of an isolated room with another inmate.
Well, that's difficult. I guess hypothetically a eunuch could fall under that in certain circumstances, but I think the bigger problem is there are trans people that actually do transition, believe it or not, a lot now don't, but the ones that do, you can't just put them in a male prison. They're clearly going to be raped and beat. That's just a no-brainer. You can't put, men have sex with each other and they're not even gay in prison because there's nothing. Imagine if you throw a trans woman in, it's going to be an issue regardless.
Oh, hello. How are we doing? Blaire, you look fabulous. You're giving Carrie a run for her money, but nobody outshines like Justin over there on the far left. I just want to ask a question, and I just want to see a quick show of hands, and then I'm going to ask like a second question and let you guys get more detail. But I want a quick show of hands. Should a father who has a child with cancer who needs chemotherapy to live be able to refuse chemotherapy on his behalf? Okay, now should a parent who has a trans child, who this child identifies as trans, all the doctors agree this child is trans, all the doctors agree that puberty blockers are probably best for this child, should that parent be able to interfere on that child's behalf and refuse treatment for their gender dysphoria?
False equivalence.
It is a false equivalence, and I don't agree with the premise because I don't think cancer is the same thing as gender dysphoria, which, like we've said, there's a lot of studies that show up to 80% of kids grow out of it. You're not giving them the chance by putting them on medication. And also, it's a lot of emotional manipulation happening, this whole line of would you rather have a dead kid or an alive trans kid, as if that's the only two options. Your kid is going to kill themselves if you don't sterilize them. That's emotional blackmail against parents. The situation is not that dire. I'm transgender. I've never had a suicidal ideation or thought in my life. And so this narrative, again, a lot of these suicide statistics also come out of activist groups that serve to gain off having these statistics be heightened. I don't think that it's just one of two options. I don't think your kid's dead or your kid's trans. I think simplifying it to that doesn't do anyone any favors.
Okay, Blaire, if I have a trans child who is depressed, who is anxious, who has suicidal thoughts,
I think you fight the suicide. I don't think you have to fight the gender part until
how do I fight
clearly
the
there's
suicide?
Huh?
How do I fight the suicide?
I mean, I don't know how you fight suicide. I'm not educated on, fighting back against suicidal
It's not a question
ideation.
we can answer for you.
Yeah, it's different, and every situation is different. And again, reducing it to dead kid or trans kid is false.
I have two very, very short, quick questions. One to Josh, right? Earlier, you intentionally misgendered Leah Thomas. Would you do the same thing to Blaire Wright because she's sitting right next to you? And the second question is to, I don't remember your name, Colin? Yes. At the very beginning of this, you said that dysphoria was a necessary component in order to identify someone as being trans. But if someone has transitioned, they've got all the surgeries, they've got all the hormones, and they no longer experience dysphoria, what do you call that person? Do you still call that person a trans person since they're no longer experiencing dysphoria, or?
Well, it's like if you have depression or something and you're taking medication, I mean, you have to maintain the medication, otherwise you'll presumably go back to being depressed or something. So it's, yeah, you're receiving it even though if your dysphoria goes away. I would say you're still trans because you're receiving a certain treatment. It's ongoing.
And then I'd also like to add one thing. I've been in the trans community long enough to know that transition is not a cure for dysphoria. It is, in certain situations like mine and like other people I know, a great help for it and can reduce it greatly. But I don't know a single trans person that has zero dysphoria left after transition, especially because there's varying rates of success with transition. So I don't think it's that black and white.
I'm glad you actually asked that question. It's something I thought about actually before you and I met. And how
Thanks for turning it into a personal conversation.
How that was good. No, this is actually interesting. I'll answer the first part first, and the second part second. I didn't misgender Leah Thomas. I correctly sexed him. Second part of this, I'm
Let
sorry.
him
Say
answer.
again. Excuse me. It's not your turn, sir.
And thanks for signing me up for this conversation too, by the way. Love it, love it.
This is something I thought a lot about because I will not do compelled speech, and whether you agree with me, telling the truth is a very important moral value to me, and it has a lot to do with why I do my show and why I talk about the subjects I do. But I'm also a gay man who remembers when I was younger, that we had people like you, Blaire, and people who simply dressed in a certain way, or men who were more feminine. We all automatically said she for them, or he for the butch lesbians who were like that, because we were part of a community of people who cared about each other. And in those days, because I don't actually like to make people feel bad, I wouldn't get up in Blaire's face and say, I want to make you feel like I don't respect you. I don't want to be mean or cruel, but I won't accept the dichotomy that in order for me not to be mean and cruel, that I have to do something that I genuinely believe is lying about the truth. This is a tough issue. I don't know how to answer you better than that, but that's how I feel.
And also, no one's compelling you. I'm not sitting here, we interacted before this. No one's compelling, exactly. Exactly. But the interesting thing is this gentleman clearly wanted there to be some revelation of animosity and clearly wanted you to be consistent with it's and so that was a right, exactly.
Have we considered
That's the wait. I would assume that's the trans ally, right? Who basically just set the trans woman up on stage to have someone possibly do that. Just saying. Just saying. Right, clearly.
Have we considered that this might be motivated by drug companies just looking for more business?
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
No.
Thank you guys so much. We're going to wrap it up. Yeah, we're going to have a short break before the next panel, I believe. Yeah? And just a round
8 minutes.
of applause for our panelists again. Thank you.